more affordable by design. And, you know, the best thing about all of that is it supports the community that we're trying to make a home for and create opportunity for here. With regards to the housing tools and strategies work that's underway and that has had some conversations at council, we would really like, and we, Better Housing Together, would really like to see that work continue, and the public engagement and citizen involvement work that has been done through that work group over the end of 2018, the last, I guess, 5 or 6 months of 2018, move forward. And if there's additional work that's needed on the technical side and additional work that is needed to engage more underrepresented stakeholders, by all means, we would encourage the city to do that work. They may not necessarily be the same conversations, but we really do think that there's something useful in that work that can be carried forward. The other piece of work that's underway that I just want to encourage the commission and the city to push ahead with is the code audit project that's underway. And I say that because we need more information, and we need better information in order to inform the proposals that we're making. It's a better use of the public's time and individual community members' time if the broader public conversations that we're scheduling have good research underlying them, and we're bringing people real questions that have some analysis behind them. So we would very much like to see that work move forward. We've heard extensively from our own work groups and focus group efforts over this past year involving many dozen people engaged in the development of housing, and planning of housing, building of housing, that there are a lot of problems in our current code, and that we're hoping that this audit will help to daylight some of those and then help us to push a path forward that we can be proud of and that will help us start to address our challenges. So thank you for continuing that work, and I'm sure we will be in touch as our efforts continue as well.
All right, thank you very much. Does anybody have any? All right, well, we're going to move on to item B on our agenda, which is our work session on the land use code audit. And I have Jennifer Knapp up to present.
And I'm going to put myself ahead of Jennifer just a little bit. Yeah, come here.
It doesn't.
Okay, I'll just scoot closer. I'm Terry Harding. I'm the manager of the Long Range Planning Team for the City of Eugene. And we have Jennifer Knapp, an urban designer on our team, Jamin Kimmel, and I'm blanking, Kathy Horliss, thank you, our consultant. So they'll all have lots to tell you, but I wanted to first explain a little bit about the housing tools and strategies process, which was at council last week, and just give you a little update on that before launching into the topic of the day. So last Wednesday, there was a presentation to council on housing tools and strategies given by Ann Fifield and myself, and we included the slide that's up right now in the council's packet and also in your packet. And it provides a kind of overview or framework of work that is underway and work that we've already finished and some work that's coming up. So it's fairly obvious, but the pictures across the top there show how the idea of a home becomes a real place you can live in, starting with a vision and progressing to a foundation and then the actual building of the structure and then moving in. At the citywide scale, it starts with our community vision for housing, which is expressed by the Envision Eugene pillar of providing housing affordable to all income levels in our community. I'll just touch briefly on the top line, which talks about the consolidated plan, because that's a whole universe of things, but it deals with an adopted plan that outlines how we spend federal dollars related to supporting lower income households. And then across the top there, you can see we're considering implementing a construction excise tax, which would be one way we would fund additional affordable housing programs. The rest of the diagram talks about projects and policies related to housing for everyone, all income levels, and really implements Goal 10 of our statewide planning program. And those projects in the policy column really are the foundational items that we look to set the direction for our future work implementing. So in 2017, we adopted the urban growth boundary, and the work behind that included several chapters of our comprehensive plan and a lengthy and detailed housing needs analysis, which ended with having a conclusion that we had enough land for the urban growth boundary for housing through 2032, but also included launching a growth monitoring program and urban reserves and a whole bunch of implementing projects to monitor that over time. We did not, however, finish the chapter on housing or the parcel-specific diagram, and so those two items are in the foundation column but have not yet been completed. Meanwhile, we launched a number of projects to begin implementing Envision Eugene, including work in River Road and Santa Clara neighborhoods, our clear and objective housing criteria update, this code audit that we're going to be talking about, work on accessory dwelling units, and tracking several state bills that relate to how we do housing planning in our community. Now, the projects that are in that list, projects current, all have some relationship to ideas that were generated by the Housing Tools and Strategies Work Group. So that's why those are up there. It's not everything, but it's ones that were talked about with that group. And finishing the foundational items and the projects that are currently underway will enable the city to take future actions shown in the far right column, such as updating our code, addressing the findings of this audit, updating our comprehensive plan map and our zoning, as well as other code amendments that we find necessary to implement adopted policy. So that's the short version. I did share with council some more detail about how our next steps in doing the housing chapter and the parcel-specific diagram, but I thought you would all want to know that those are still on our work plan, and we have staff dedicated to doing them, and council was pretty supportive of us prioritizing finishing those documents while we're also attempting to finish the other ones that are underway. Any questions about that before we dig into the code audit? Sure.
So you said that there was the evaluation that there was enough buildable lands to build the housing we needed until 2032. Is that still the evaluation, or is there some sense that actually we're going to hit that earlier than 2032?
Great question. So we have an adopted buildable lands inventory and urban growth boundaries. So the technical answer is we have enough through 2032. But we also have, I want to say, from a requirements standpoint, we are required to count all the land within our urban growth boundary if it is vacant, passed all the tests that we studied through the buildable lands inventory. What we have heard is that it's not so simple from the development community and folks who are using our code and trying to build housing. So it's kind of both and that was a big reason why we started the growth monitoring program and urban reserves, is that we want to track our numbers from a comprehensive standpoint and report back on that. We also want to do everything we can to make sure that that land that we say is available actually is. And so that, hence the code work that is underway.
Great, that was helpful.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No. Okay. On to Jennifer, who's going to explain about the code audit.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Knapp. I'm an urban design planner with the Planning Division, and I just wanted to read you a bit of background information on the funding for this grant. The funding was provided through the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, from the Oregon Housing Planning Project. The grant was established to assist communities with increasing housing affordability within the urban growth boundary, to implement House Bill 4006. Priority was given to cities over 10,000 in population and severely rent burdened, both of which apply to Eugene. Severe rent burden is defined as where 25% or more of renter households spend more than 50% of their income on housing costs. The most recent data shows that 37% of Eugene renters are severely cost burdened. The funding is allowing Angelo Planning Group to complete a code audit to help ensure the zoning code allows and does not include barriers to development of housing for all income levels, as identified in the city's 2017 housing needs analysis. Council has prioritized increasing the affordability, availability, and diversity of housing across the city of Eugene. At its May 30th, 2018 work session, Council gave direction to staff to move forward with a process of identifying tools and strategies to influence housing outcomes. And so I'm going to introduce Kathy Corliss and Jamin Kimmel, and they're of Angelo Planning Group, and they're going to present their methodology for analyzing the code.
Great. So thanks for having us. I'm Jamin Kimmel with Angelo Planning Group, and I guess we'll share a mic if we need to. But yeah.
Or you could pull that one over.
Yeah. So I'll be walking you through most of the presentation. Kathy might jump in if I miss something or she wants to make sure something else gets covered. But I'll walk you through it. Kathy and I have been working together on the code audit for a couple months now and working with staff. And so excited to share our preliminary findings and our approach and get your feedback. So let me open up the slides. And you should have gotten the slides in a packet as well. So in terms of agenda for the presentation, we'll just provide some background on the project shortly. You got some from Jennifer, so I think we'll go quickly through that. Just share our approach of...
Could I ask just a quick question? Do you want us to save questions for the end of the
Yeah, that's a good
presentation
question.
or interrupt you?
I have a couple of spots where I think it's appropriate to stop and,
Okay.
and ask for questions. Yeah, you could kind of get through a good stopping point. Thanks. Yeah. We'll walk through our approach to doing a code audit, how we kind of tackled this issue, and then summarize some of our preliminary findings. And like I said, we'll pause a couple of times for questions. So Jennifer mentioned this is a DLCD grant. So due to the grant requirements, it has a fairly compressed schedule, so everything has to be done by June of 2019. And the focus of the scope of the project is on identifying the issues in the code to a particular set of housing types. And so we're looking at identifying barriers, not necessarily now looking at developing solutions or kind of figuring out what type of code amendments or updates might be appropriate. But really the purpose here is to kind of inventory all of the potential issues, get a roadmap where now in the city in the future wants to come back and look at code updates to allow different housing types potentially, and know all the issues and could be more informed in what types of amendments are necessary to remove barriers. So really kind of inventory and roadmap is the concept. DLCD is the funder of the project, and that was really the intent from DLCD, and I think the legislation for funding this project was to have cities take a close look at their code and try to find these barriers. So it's kind of part of the context of where it's coming from. So in terms of the purpose and scope, talked a bit about this already, but the idea is to analyze the code, look for criteria or procedures that could hinder housing development, look for ways that those procedures could more effectively implement state requirements, and then that the code allows for a mix and density of allowable housing to accommodate the housing needs that were identified in the housing needs analysis. That's kind of the formal scope language. The deliverables we'll be providing to the city are a draft code audit, a final code audit, and then we've had some meetings with staff and then 2 meetings with you, the Planning Commission, who will be functioning as the advisory committee for the project. Here's how the schedule lays out. So as I mentioned, we've been working on the code audit for a few months now and have had a few good meetings with staff to work on the approach. We are kind of there at that green star in March, so meetings with the Planning Commission. We'll get your feedback, and we're going to be finalizing a draft of the code audit, delivering that to staff. Make a few revisions to that, and then provide a draft to you to review prior to our next meeting with you, which I think is scheduled in May, if I'm correct.
April 20th.
April 22nd, yeah. So that's the schedule, and we'll finalize the audit by June, and that will function as a hopefully a good background document and research document for future work. So a little bit more on the approach. So how did we go about identifying barriers? And so the approach we decided to take was to use a set of prototypes. So prototype is really just an example of each of these housing types. And the reason we decided to kind of try to define prototypes is that it's kind of difficult to test for, to know if a specific standard is a barrier if you know kind of what you're testing for. And pretty specifically, kind of duplex can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. And so need to kind of be explicit about what kinds of duplexes we're talking about and what they look like. And so what we tried to do was lay that out and with some data and some, numeric assumptions behind how big the building is, how many parking spaces it has, what size of lot it needs, and that helps us to be explicit about what we're testing for when we say something's a barrier. It's a barrier to this type of duplex. So that's why we developed these prototypes. Hopefully that helps for the future work to understand why something is a barrier, because you can look at the prototype and say, oh, okay, I understand, because they were assuming this was the kind of building that would be proposed. The prototypes came from a few different sources. So the city has a missing middle handbook of put together kind of defining what these missing middle type of housing look like. And the state has put out a few reports that have compiled examples of these housing, this types of housing from across the state. And so we use those, sometimes even went into Google Earth and took actual measurements of the buildings to see kind of how big they are and how they fit on a lot, and took that information into account as well. So a few different sources. In general, we tried to define prototypes that represented the missing middle concept, which is that they are potentially compatible with single-family neighborhoods or lower density neighborhoods. Maybe not all of them, and maybe not in all locations, but generally could be. And then secondly, that we had seen some evidence that these prototypes were being built, that they were kind of realistic, and that they were built either in Eugene or in other places. And so we used those, tried to use those as examples if they were realistic. Okay, so I'll first walk through the prototypes so you can get an understanding of what we're looking at and what we're testing for. And we'll stop after I get through all the prototypes and see if you have questions about what the assumptions are. So first up is accessory dwelling units. I think the city has called these secondary dwelling units in the past, might be transitioning to accessory in the future. They can be created in a few different ways, but generally it's added to an existing house with a single family home, or a lot with a single family house on it. It could be attached as an addition to the house. It could be a detached separate structure in the backyard, or it could be a conversion of an existing floor area within the house, so an attic or a basement converted to an apartment suite. So we tested for all three of those types of accessory dwelling units. I'd say that the attached and the detached, the only difference between those two is that one's attached, one's detached. Otherwise, we assume they're about the same size. So, this is a building, and this, I guess I should pause. This is what our prototype information looks like. This is the information we use to test against the barriers. So the width and depth of the building, how high it is, number of stories, what parking it has, and then the needed lot size, which is not the minimum lot size required by the code, but just how big of a lot would be needed to accommodate that building, kind of in a basic minimum level. So, like I said, we had tested for 3 different types of ADUs. The attached and detached are assumed to be about the same size. This is, 1.5 stories, 600 to 800 square feet, somewhere in that range. But the footprint is only about 400 square feet. And since we assume there's another house on this lot, then the kind of minimum lot size I think you would need to accommodate something like that is about a 40 by 100 lot or 4,000 square feet. So that's that prototype. Another one is small lot detached houses. So these are, in terms of their basic form, are no different than a conventional single-family detached house, just on a much smaller lot. And because they're on a smaller lot, they might have smaller, narrower setbacks and cover more of the lot, so a higher lot coverage. These are some examples. The one on the far right, I think, is from Eugene. Here's the prototype information. So we just tested for a 3-story version of a small lot detached house and a 2-story. Fairly narrow building, so 15 to 20 feet wide. And on a fairly narrow lot, 25 to 30 feet wide is kind of what we had in mind. Assume 1 parking space, and a lot of times it's in a garage. And then for each of the prototypes, we calculated the density, or what would be the equivalent density, in order to compare it to the density standards in the code. So this is about 22 units per acre. So row houses is next. So similar form as the small lot detached and kind of looks similar, but the difference here is that the units are attached. And so they're on their own lot. So the city defines these as a row house, but another term is a townhouse or townhome. And just the key feature here is that these units are attached, but they're on their own lot. Again, tested 2 versions, and really just the difference is one of them is a 3-story row house and one of them is 2-story. Primarily, we test the difference between if it's 3 or 2-story to look at how height regulations would affect it. So the prototype we tested has 5 attached row house units, so kind of as a one building, but has 5 units. Total size of the building is about 100 feet wide, but each unit or each row house is about 20 feet wide. We assume a lot that's 140 by 120, which would give enough space for the building, as well as setbacks and some room for vehicle circulation that's needed, a driveway. And so with 5 units on that size lot, it equates to about 13 units per acre for density. Next is duplexes. So duplexes are defined specifically in the Eugene code, and this is the definition here. Basically, it boils down to 2 units on one lot attached. They can come in a few different forms. The units might be stacked on top of each other as flats, so that's why we have a stacked duplex format we tested for, and then also a side-by-side duplex. And from what we've seen, the side-by-side version seems to be developed more often recently. It seems to be more popular with recent developments than stacked apartments or stacked duplex. And so here are those 2 prototypes. The stacked duplex is a relatively small building, 25 by 60, so not much larger than most single-family homes or some single-family homes. For that reason, the lot size that's needed is fairly small. It's a 4,000 square foot lot, could fit something like this. The side-by-side duplex is a little bit wider. Typically, they have garages up to each of the units, but is less deep than the stacked duplex, so kind of a wider and shallow building. And the density for both of them comes out to about 22 units per acre. Okay, so triplexes and fourplexes. Same concept as a duplex, multiple units on one lot, but this time either 3 or 4 units. And we group these together because they're often subject to the same standards or similar types of standards so a triplex and a fourplex are, whether it's either one of those. The prototypes here, we did do a stacked and a side-by-side version of each of these. Same concept really as the duplex. The stacked one's kind of a narrower and deeper building and taller. Side by side's kind of wider building that starts to look very similar to a row house building, but really the only difference here is that they're on one lot. So it's a multifamily development versus a single family attached, which is row house or townhouse. Lot sizes range from 4,000 to 7,200 square feet. Generally, you need larger lots or wider lots for the side-by-side versions. The stacked version could fit on a narrower lot. And the density range is 23 to 34 units per acre. All right. So next one is courtyard apartments, and we also say other small-scale multifamily here. The concept in Eugene's Missing Middle guidebook is a particular kind of form of small-scale multifamily, which is a courtyard apartment. It's typically a kind of U-shaped building oriented around a common green, and might be between 8 and 12, 15 units, something in that range. And so that's kind of mostly what we have in mind, but a lot of the barriers to that type of development would also apply to other small apartment buildings or small-scale multifamily, and so we want to recognize that. But the prototype we specifically defined to test for was a 8-unit courtyard apartment building. It is 1 story. It's on a 120 by 120 lot, which I think is a kind of standard double lot in Eugene. So the lot size is about 14,000 square feet and a density of about 15 units per acre is what that equates out to. Really, I think the image on the left here, that graphic, is a pretty good example of that. The building could be one U-shaped building or multiple structures like that. Some similar kind of form is what we have in mind. Okay, last prototype is cottage cluster housing. So you might have already discussed this in the past or familiar with the concept, but generally it's thought of as kind of 4 to 12 small cottages or small detached houses oriented around a common courtyard green space. So similar to a courtyard apartment, but the units are just detached, is what's most different about that. So as well as being smaller units, which could be more affordable to a wider range of people, they're also seem to be attractive to some people because it provides kind of a communal living experience. And so that's kind of one of the reasons I think that you're starting to see these get developed. Important kind of nuance with these is that they could be developed on one lot as a multifamily type of project, where even though they're detached units, they could be defined as multifamily. Or they can be on their own individual lots as single family. It's just the lots are oriented towards a courtyard and would probably have, if it was part of a subdivision, would have a open space, commonly owned tract for the open space. So the version we tested would be, or two prototypes we tested of a cottage cluster, one being 4 units on a 120 by 120 lot, and then a larger one, which is 8 units on a 180 by 120 lot. The size of the cottages varies, but the concept is for them to be really no bigger than about 1,200 square feet. That's the way they're typically regulated, as a way of trying to limit the size of the buildings and make them feel more compatible with a single family neighborhood. So we assume that about that size of building. 1 parking space per unit, and the density equates to about 12 to 16 units per acre. So that was a lot to get through, but hopefully not overwhelming or anything, but I want to just kind of pause there and see if there's any questions about those prototypes before we go into like the audit portion of it.
I have Commissioner Borofsky and then Commissioner Randall.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't have any problems. I think the methodology that you worked on those prototypes was good. My question is, why did we pick those prototypes? For me, when I go and look at the housing needs analysis, when I heard barriers that we can find in the code, I was looking for all housing types. And I'm wondering why we didn't look at what the barriers are to larger multifamily ones, because that's a big need in the housing need analysis. This type of structures at best hits 20% of the housing needs analysis for multifamilies. So to me, if we're looking at ways to lower costs and find barriers so that we can hit our affordable housing needs analysis, why wasn't larger multifamily, and why wasn't single family looked at? What are the barriers for single family? One thing's looked at. That's my first question on the methodology. Who told you to look at missing middle and missing middle only?
I did. I won't make them answer that. So Jennifer went over the funding for this project was provided by DLCD, and so we worked with Patrick Wingard, who's here from DLCD, on the scope. And when we were applying for the grant, we did ask for a complete code audit to look at all housing types, but the funding that was available was significantly lower than we thought it was going to be, and so we had to pick and choose and focus the available staff time and consultant time on certain housing types. So I think it's a really good question why we didn't include larger multifamily, and I would love to do that. We might be able to get additional funding, not this cycle, but in the next cycle. But the short answer is we didn't have funding to do everything, and we didn't have any knowledge of barriers to single family like we had started to gather about the ones that we chose to focus on. The other thing I would say is that we are in the middle of the Clear and Objective Housing Project, which is also looking at barriers to subdivisions and PUDs and those sorts of things. So some of that work is covered by that project.
If I might, you may,
Yes.
Kathy Corliss. Yeah, I think for the purposes of the next draft, we can certainly look at whether larger format multifamily would be subject to the same barriers as we identified for smaller format. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. I think we can take a look and see if it's not outside the scope of the project for us to go and look and see, well, would we find the same barriers? And we may. So I think we can do that when we bring you the next draft, or when you see the draft and we have our next meeting. We'll try and provide you a little bit more background information about that. Similarly, the small lot detached house, the barriers for that prototype, if it's a barrier to that prototype, it's likely a barrier for a standard single-family dwelling, because that's really pushing the envelope of what could qualify. So if we've identified, if it ends up being a barrier for that housing type, you'll find it's a barrier for standard single-family, and likely standard single-family would have fewer barriers. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
okay.
mean, one of my concerns is again, I go back, when you reference the housing needs analysis, I went back and read the 180 pages of the housing. Now, I didn't read all of it, but I read pertinent sections of it. And what I feel is, I mean, these are all great prototypes, and I think they're things that are being pushed forward not only at our local level, but they're being pushed forward at the state level. And I personally don't see them as of allowing housing for all income levels. And I think that as far as what can get built and what can be built efficiently, these are going to be good, but I don't think they're going to be as affordable to a lot of our population as if you were to build a 20-unit multifamily house. And so for me, if there's a way, if there's barriers, whether there are multi-jurisdiction or not, the multifamily standards that are making it more difficult and more expensive to build that 20-unit place on our key transit corridors, which is what we're looking for in Envision Eugene, I want to see those, as well. Because if there's things in the code that you can go out and talk to developers, I wish Kristen were here, but, if you can go and talk to developers and say, you know what? This setback or this open space requirement in multifamily is making it so that I can't make that 20-unit one on River Road. That is as much of a piece for me as is being able to put an ADU in the back. Because if you look at the housing needs analysis, those are where we have said in our adopted UGB, we are going to put a majority of our door fronts. So that's what I'm hoping we can get out of this.
Just a quick clarification, we are testing up to 20 units per acre within the current scope, so that's good.
We can take a closer look at
Yeah.
that for the next version. Thank you, that's a great comment.
Commissioner Randall?
Hey, when you did the prototypes, were those independent of our current code and just general, so it was just a general prototype? Because I was noticing on the ADU, the maximum height was 20 feet and ours is 18. You also had 1.5 story, and so when you get down to 18 feet and 1.5 stories, that gets really difficult to do. I was just curious about, so it is independent of what our current code is?
Yeah, the idea would be to test something that is reasonable that we've seen developed in other places or that we think there would be demand for, but might be pushing the current code. It was one idea. And also, these were developed really before doing the code audit. So we developed these as, these are good examples of what seems to be, have been built in other places. And so we'd like to test them.
I was going to add, I think we also discussed the fact that if you actually set the prototypes to be consistent with the current code, we wouldn't have any barriers, right? So, I mean, in order to identify barriers,
Wouldn't have any,
you would, if it met the current code, if the prototype was consistent with the current code, we would not identify barriers because it would be allowed by the current code. And so,
okay.
does that make sense? So the nature of a
Seems like it's almost the opposite.
Right. The nature of the prototypes is to evaluate whether the code is precluding something that might be a possible outcome. In order to, I think the phrase that was used was to daylight the issues, and I think that's a great phrase. The action you take on those, whether you decide that those barriers are barriers that you want to act on, is a different question. But we were trying to look and see what are possible barriers and just to identify those. And then it's a policy decision. It's part of your comprehensive plan update. It's those policy conversations. Once you know, well, these are possible barriers, you have a lot of flexibility. You can say, right, that's a barrier, but it's also a regulation that we want to maintain or not. So the prototypes were set to specifically, as Jim had said, push the code. Yeah, a little, yeah. With the intention.
My concern with that is that as we move forward, not only are we identifying some of the barriers, but then we're also needing to change parts of the code that maybe, I guess if we're willing to and aware of what needs to change, if let's say an ADU has to go from 18 to 20 feet as far as the height because of that prototype, or even taller, when we get into that next phase, if we actually pick up on that and follow through, I guess would be my concern, because it seems like with this, we've got a prototype that we can't do here anyway. And so when we get into the code, are we going to actually change the code then to identify that, which I know is outside the scope of what you're doing. You're just doing the research and the base stuff. But I guess that's what the thing I want to point out now, that once we get forward into all of this, we need to be ready to do something.
Right. I think that is the idea, is that this is giving you information, and these prototypes hopefully will raise some awareness about potential barriers, and then it's up to you to decide, are those, because I mean, every regulation is a barrier in its own way. That's the nature, right? You're stopping certain things, and some of those are consistent with your comp plan, they're appropriate. And we're not saying that every one of these prototypes is necessarily something that you want everywhere. It's just a way of looking at the code to say, okay, these are the things that rise to the surface given these prototypes. it's up to you then to decide whether those are appropriate barriers, inappropriate barriers, whether that's a problem, so.
Okay, Commissioner Ramey?
Sorry, just a series of questions. Following up a little bit on Commissioner Randall's questions, I hate to dig into the details of the prototypes, but I'm just not sure how important that is. And frankly, I'm a little nervous that if we don't get the prototypes right at this point, we're going to miss big gaps in the analysis later on. So bear with me while I walk through a couple of questions. Some of them are going to be embarrassingly obvious, I'm sure. Accessory dwelling units, what's the difference between a duplex and an attached accessory dwelling unit, and why would we make that distinction?
Yeah, it's a good question because often that line gets blurred, but typically, in the code, the way that an accessory dwelling unit is defined is a maximum unit size of 800 square feet. They're just subject to an entirely different set of standards. So they might look very similar, but if someone wanted to propose a house with an ADU, they would just need to meet the ADU set of standards in order for that to be developed. And so those standards are different in terms of the size of the ADU, the lot size that's required. So duplex is subject to a lot of different things. It's a good question that in the future, if the city might want to consider squaring that up so that duplexes and ADUs would be subject to similar type.
For purposes of this exercise, you're really talking about the difference in the size of the units,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So
it's
why
kind of
wouldn't
like
you
one-
say prototypically, we want units that are this size, and we don't care whether it's a duplex or it's an attached ADU, because the size is what's driving the exercise, right?
It is a really good point. I mean, one could say if you said, well, we're going to have duplexes, and if you had a duplex where the units, at least one of the units was 800 square feet or smaller, why isn't that allowed everywhere that you would allow an ADU? And I guess in a sense you would, because you're just calling it something different. And it's subject to, the ADUs are subject to other, and have traditionally been subject to other
Yeah,
limitations.
but those are not in this exercise.
Well, we haven't actually gotten to that. We should
Okay,
move
well,
on. But maybe you'll see more of
moving
that
on.
when we talk about what we
I'll
found.
move on.
Yeah, fair question, though.
Lot sizes, so the ADU lot sizes, that presumes there's a residence on the lot, and then there has to be room to add another unit. That's how we're getting 4,000 square feet. Okay.
All right.
Sorry. So in the duplex section, the stacked versus side-by-side duplex, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at this for 5 minutes, so I'm not having the depth that you are.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me that the building footprint would be the same. And that's not what your chart reads. And then that has an effect on how wide the lot is. So,
Well, I think the key difference there is that in order to have a side-by-side, you kind of have, the building has to be wider.
oh, sorry, yeah, I've got it the other way around, right?
Yeah, the building has to be wider really to fit two units side by side, so it's going to be bigger.
I'm remembering.
Yeah, stacked. Yeah.
Seems like they'd be twice the size then. You'd have one stacked would be size A, side by side would be A plus A.
Not typically. Yeah, both would be 2 stories. So the units in a side by side, and these are based on just examples we've seen. What we've seen, typically the units in a side by side are larger. They might be 1,700 or 2,000 square feet each, whereas in a stacked duplex they'd be more like 1,000 or
Right.
or 1,500 square
Like a
feet.
single level.
No, I'm actually, I'm illustrating whether I should care or not. That is not logical, what you just said, that I know what you're saying, in the market,
Yeah.
they're different sizes, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would that be? So,
To your point, the prototype, why not make the prototype the same size? Like if it's, we should assume a building square footage or a unit square footage that's identical.
correct.
Okay,
And then if
fair
you
enough.
stack it,
Oh, you can stack it or you can have it
and I
side by
just,
side.
and again,
Yeah.
I'm circling back, I don't know how important that is, whether it's in the noise of the exercise, but I can see how it's affecting the width of the lot in this case. I'm like,
Yeah,
okay, maybe
yeah.
it is important, so.
Yeah, the key thing is probably the width of the lot and the width of the building.
Yeah, but it's a good point. Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Is that it?
Thank you.
I put myself in the queue because I had a question about the scope of the barriers that you're assessing and what you're looking at. And I'm curious to know if you have been looking at anything such as systems development charges and fees that are applied differently, things like potential construction excise tax, which at different levels are, it's going to have an impact. And I know we had some preliminary research that was done that, you know, there's a percentage number that actually would threaten the financial feasibility of certain missing middle types. And then other things like susceptibility to appeals and things like that. And I'm just curious if that is being looked at as part of this overall audit.
So the first one on SDCs and other fees, we didn't look at that. That wasn't really part of the scope. It was really focused on the land use code. And the approach to that would really need to build in economic kind of modeling of it, of taking a pro forma and applying those costs and seeing how that affects financial feasibility. And that wasn't really in scope for us. We typically partner with like an economics firm who could do that work. So for this one, we're really just looking at more of the physical barriers, is like this size of building could fit on this size a lot, but it's not allowed kind of thing. We consider some economic barriers based on how the code might increase costs for something. But and then the second question on susceptibility to appeal, did you mean in terms of the procedure that it goes under?
Right, that are more susceptible to neighborhood appeals, or a developer would appeal, or, you know, I mean, I'm just curious if that's something that, even historical data that's being looked at.
Yeah, we didn't look at what has been appealed more often into looking at data for that, but generally we looked at what procedure would be required to approve this, you know, type 1, 2, or 3,
Right.
and generally if it was required a type 2 or 3, that would have more potential appeal. Then we noted that as a potential barrier or something that might discourage development.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think that answers my questions. We're all good? All right, so if you guys want to continue on,
Okay.
take us through the next part.
Sure. So now we're getting into some of the findings. So I'm going to present a few examples of barriers assessment for the prototypes. And we don't have all of them for you here today. We're still kind of finalizing them. We're going to step through a couple of them. So this is what the kind of basic format of the audit looks like, identifying all the standards that are applicable to that housing type, and then giving it kind of a rating of the level of barrier. You know, not the most precise method, but it's just a way of kind of categorizing what level that barrier is at, or if there's no barrier at all. And so the not a barrier is those green checks. Doesn't really seem like an issue. The potential or moderate barriers, the orange kind of yield sign, and then the red warning sign could be a significant barrier. So that's kind of the rating. And then with that, there's assessment and some notes and some additional information, so to explain that. Where it varies by zone, we also note that. So these slides just have it kind of summarize across the zones or in total citywide, but we break it out by zone where the standards vary by zone. And so this is the example for ADUs. I'm not going to run through all this because I actually have a separate slide that helps to illustrate some of the issues a little bit more. But the key barriers that we found to ADUs are the maximum density in the R1 zone, the minimum lot area requirement in the R1 zone, which is a similar type of standard, owner occupancy requirement, and the parking standard for ADUs. So I'll come back to those because I have a different slide on that. Duplexes, so duplexes are allowed in all zones, but there are some special use limitations in some zones that are barriers. Maximum density in the R1 zone is a significant barrier, so in order to meet the maximum density standard, a duplex would need to be on a 6,100 square foot lot in the R1 zone. And so that's 14 units per acre is the maximum density. But then there's a special use regulation that kind of supersedes that requires that duplexes be built on a 8,000 square foot lot that is on a corner, or was designated a duplex lot in a subdivision plat. And so the 8,000 square foot lot is significantly larger than the prototype duplex we showed you, which could be as low as 4,000 square feet. 4,000 to 5,000 square feet is kind of what you could fit a duplex that size on. Requiring the larger lot, we identified as a barrier because it limits the number of lots across the city that a duplex would become eligible to be built on. And so really just restricts the number of places where it can be built, and that is a barrier in itself to the citywide potential for duplexes. It also increases the land costs because you have to acquire a larger lot, which just is more cost to the development, which could be an economic barrier to it. And then, in addition to the lot being larger, the requirement that it must be on a corner and also or was designated as on a subdivision plat further kind of restricts the number of lots where these could be developed. So we see that in terms of thinking about the citywide potential for duplexes. It's limiting that fairly it's restricting that to a small number of lots. There are some other standards that are potential barriers, but there's significantly less so than the maximum density and minimum lot area requirements. So one more example for cottage clusters. So a little more orange here, a little bit less red, I guess is how I'd characterize it. The cottage clusters are allowed in all zones, but there are some development standards that would be potential barriers. Maximum density is less of a barrier. These are slightly less dense than a duplex or a triplex or some of the other housing types, but could be a barrier for some types of cottage clusters. The real more significant barriers for cottage clusters are the minimum lot area and minimum lot width, which if those were applied to an individual lot in a cluster, so these are fairly small cottage units is the concept, so they're about 1,200 square feet. The individual lots can be as low as 1,700 or 2,000 square feet, but the minimum lot size in all zones is 4,500 square feet. And so that would be a significant barrier to try to work around that if it was applied to those individual lots. If it's applied to if it's a multifamily development and it's applied to the entire one lot that all of the cottages are on, then it's less of an issue. But it's not clear in the code that for cottage clusters that wouldn't be applied to an individual lot. So basically this would be not so much a barrier to the multifamily format of this development, but if it was divided into individual lots, which I think is often preferred by these types of developers, then it would be a significant barrier. This is a table that summarizes the kind of a barriers assessment for each prototype and all the zones. So this is a fairly high-level summary. So a few caveats. The R1.5 zone is really intended for row houses. It's really the stated purpose of the zone, so it's not surprising that there are barriers to all the other different types of housing types. So all the red you see in the R1.5 zone makes kind of sense for what that zone was intended for. And there's also a lot of orange here, which I think this is saying that there are some things that might be barriers in some cases, but might not be in other cases. So just kind of a caveat. But I think just two broader patterns I'd like to highlight in this summary. So there are significant barriers to most missing middle types in the R1 zone. And I'll cover that in a little bit more detail. And then what I think was interesting when putting this together is that the R2 zone is where you see fewer barriers to most of these housing types. And I think that reflects this idea that these are kind of missing middle types. The R2 zone is kind of a medium density zone. And so what often we found going through this is that a lot of these housing types exceed the maximum density of the R1 zone, but don't quite or are close to meeting the minimum density of the R3 and R4 zone. And so they kind of fit in the R2 zone, but don't really quite meet the density standards of the other zones. And so it is kind of that missing middle concept, if that makes sense. Okay, I guess we'll pause there before I go into other findings.
Commissioner Randall.
Thank
Go
you.
that way.
I was thinking on density, and I know you're going to get into density in this next section, so I'll save some of my thoughts for that. But with ADUs, I was thinking, and maybe Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, I was thinking when we were originally, or Alyssa, that ADUs on a single-family lot didn't count as two dwellings, that we weren't adding that into the density. So that's, which I've always thought was kind of crazy, but
Prior to 2014, the code amendments at that time, we did not calculate density
Okay.
for accessory dwellings. There was still a lot size minimum. And so for an attached, it was 4,500, and for a detached, it was 6,000.
okay, but we are counting
We do
ADUs
now,
So-
right? Now they're
so a
counted
house-
towards density, and honestly, the minimum lot size is 14 units per acre, so it's 6,100.
Okay, thank you. Living in the past.
That's okay. A lot of changes.
That's all I have at the moment, yeah.
Commissioner Fragala.
Thank you. So I know you're going to be coming back to us, and you've only brought a couple of the prototypes this time. I would be interested in seeing when you bring the information next time, like what are the barriers that you're seeing stand out really significantly, like maybe some across the prototypes analysis of these standards. You know, for example, obviously the minimum lot area stands out in these three. And so I'm hoping, you know, when we see the final report that we'll see some cross-category analysis. And I'm also wondering if you are going to give any type of score to what you found, you know, like, the duplexes get a C, or, you know, the ADUs get an F or something, a scoring in terms of the number of variables that each one meets. And I see you're doing it across the zoning type, so I know this gets really complicated, but in terms of summarizing the eventual information, I think that could be really helpful.
Give that some thought.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea.
You sound like a teacher.
Yeah, I was going to say that. It's interesting coming from an educator wanting to see.
Yeah, I think we tried to use the symbols as a way of
Yeah.
doing that. Is just kind of a high, medium,
It's a
low.
great
Yeah,
visual
just to get
tool. Yeah.
that kind of oriented. But then I think with code, just a lot of it's devil in the details. So kind of making a high-level summary judgment is kind of difficult, and we want to be careful about that. And mostly we want to point out very specific things that are challenges.
Right, I think that eventually, like when we get the final information, like you said, we're going to have to make some decisions about where we want to focus. And so I think having some of those assessments available to us might be able to help us make some of those determinations.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Commissioner Ramey?
So a broad sweeping question, again, displaying perhaps my ignorance. Special use districts or overlay zones or anything that's not R1, 2, 3, 4 that allows housing is not a part of this analysis?
We've looked at them. I don't have findings on them for this one. I think by the final, we'll be able to incorporate that.
So
and
there
see
may
how
be
they
more
influence
categories,
that.
certain kinds of overlay zones or refinement plans, would they fall in that category as well? It seems like that's where we get into.
No, because we're focusing on the code. Look at all the zones that
Yeah,
allow
but if it's in the
housing,
code.
but not,
Well, what about the Walnut
Policies.
Station? Special use,
that's a special area zone, so yes.
that,
Yeah.
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
Then in following up on our educator, if we could combine these analyses so that the last slide, the one before this one, where the zones are going across the top, it seems like if you could do that for each type, so if that said duplexes and then it showed you how that worked across each of the zones, then we could see them. Maybe I'm missing something here, but that way you could combine the data and you could see the analysis for each zone because it might be different in each zone.
I think that's what we were trying to do here. So the idea is, so for ADUs,
For duplex
example,
and zone, right.
yeah, for duplex in the
What
R1
I'm
zone.
thinking about are these categories that run down the left here, which you have on your other.
Oh, on the earlier one, yeah.
Oh, okay, so,
If you change the word barrier to zone, could you run the zones across that
Oh, interesting.
and have little symbols for each zone?
Let's see.
Yeah, so that effective, I'm not sure if it's a good format in the slides, but in the audit, that it's effectively what we do. The table
Okay.
kind of lays it all out as, because sometimes the standards don't vary across the zones.
Right. Well, what led me to that was your description of the barrier in the duplexes, where I think you were talking about you're underbuilding in one case because it's a lot size. So you're either underbuilding it or you're overbuilding it, or there's an economic disadvantage. So the three different kind of criteria that all relate to lot size, but they change as you go through each unit type. And I think that would get to when we begin to see some patterns. Go, oh, I see what that is.
Okay, yeah, I think getting to this, summarizing it at some higher level that you can use to
Right.
kind of focus what your next steps might be.
And then my last comment is this idea, and I think it was getting to what Commissioner Borowski was saying at the very beginning, was we might be missing some of the effects on the higher density housing. In other words, if you do a duplex in an R4 zone, you might be precluding possible capacity in that zone. So it's going both ways, this analysis. And so I'd want to understand how underbuilding is it's not a barrier, because you can do that. It's a barrier to something else. And that's, when you were talking about the duplex, I'm thinking, yeah, these barriers they're going, and you even verbalized it that way. They're going both directions. And so trying to track that somehow I think is really important, because we're trying to be strategic about which solution is going to be the best.
Yeah.
And we don't want to just say, oh, let's build duplexes across all zones and then miss out on all this capacity that's out in 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah, no, I think in the analysis, when we look at these things where they don't meet the minimum density, then, I think would be a policy question is like, is it important enough to allow this housing type in this zone? Or is it really the more important thing that minimum density is met?
Yeah.
And we're getting the more.
Well, and it sounded like you were creeping into things that weren't necessarily, I mean, you could do a duplex in R4. There's no barrier necessarily, except there's an economic barrier to that. That's the reason you might not want to do that for economics, but that's not a code issue. And there's a density issue. You're underbuilding, but that's not
Minimum
a
density is you're not allowed to underbuild.
underbuild. So the minimum densities is trapping that scenario.
That's the, right, it's you have to build at this
But it
minimum
turns out,
density.
in this analysis, it turns up as a barrier.
It
Which
does.
says, oh, we should fix that, which is, no, maybe we shouldn't fix that, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
So that's where I'm
so.
getting hung up a little bit on the
Yeah, I think we were trying to
terms
say,
we're using.
these are barriers, whether it's an important barrier to remove, we're not making that.
Was it possible to put the barrier in the context of the overall goal, which is to create more affordable housing?
Housing out all levels, not more
Yeah.
affordable housing.
Well-
That's not our policy.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Right.
Just a quick
part
comment
A
on
of our
this.
goal.
I think you're pointing out the difficulty of us not having our policies in place yet through the comprehensive plan, because ideally they would tell us where we want to increase density, like on the corridors, and where we want to allow duplexes, but that hasn't been decided yet, so.
Yeah, well,
This will
it's
feed
not in
into
the
that
code,
policy
so they're,
discussion.
by definition, you can't really evaluate that because it's not part of the code.
And the other thing, I think that question is really interesting, and I think it raises, like, for example, if minimum density is precluding conversion of, say, existing houses in that zone to duplex, and that's something you would want to allow, but for whatever reason, they can't do it because it doesn't meet min density, but it would preserve a historic structure, you'd be moving toward compliance, and I don't know whether you'd have to correct me or not, some jurisdictions would allow that, some wouldn't. But let's say in looking at it more, we're trying to highlight the issue, give you an opportunity to then look at it more closely as a next step. And so the answer might be, oh, okay, that got highlighted through this first kind of sieving through of the code. Let's look at it. Oh, no, that's a legitimate issue. We don't want to allow those or we do allow them in a way that's appropriate, say, in the way that the city sees conversions of duplexes in that zone. And that's okay. That's all we want to allow,
Well,
so that gives you that chance to.
And I think you're,
Suss that out.
in there, by definition, you're not looking at things that could be allowed by site review or some other process. This is just come to the counter and you get your permit, right?
It is identifying process requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So if something requires a PUD, it's not showing up yet in the preliminary, but you can do a cottage cluster in R1. It just requires a PUD, which is a big barrier.
I guess that's
That will
what,
be
so
included.
those are more discretionary than than as
Their
of right.
process requirements.
And I don't know
are
where you
included in
are
the
on
scope.
that continuum of as of right versus discretionary.
Yeah, so we have we have a slide at the end on the couple of discretionary, just a preliminary look at them.
Okay. Let's, Commissioner Borofsky, did you have?
So when I look at the last slide, that one up there, oh no,
That-
this one. I see a historical trend. You know, I see that over time, the city of Eugene has decided, just by looking at this chart, single-family R1 zones are designed for single-family homes. And if you wanted to do more of a, what you're looking at here is missing middle housing, it seems like R2 is the zone that would be appropriate in. Checks and yellows. So I have to look back because this code has been developed over years and years and years. And people bought their houses and decided where they wanted to live on what their neighborhoods are like. And so just to go in and say, okay, well, R1 was designed this way over years and years and a lot of public process to get this code written. It seems to me there are areas that these missing middle houses can be built. Now, I know that this bus is being driven not solely by us, that there are people, 65 miles north of us that are driving this bus a certain direction, and that we might want to look at those things. But I also have to think about, how this code was developed, how much public input this code got over decades to get to where you're looking at this. And if we're gonna go through and change these barriers, basically what that means is we're changing neighborhoods. And what are the impacts on the neighborhoods that are a result of these code changes by removing these barriers? And for me, the public process needs to be more robust. We're in the first paragraph of our AIS, it says, that you're asking the planning commission to basically sign off on the methodology and the way that we're going because we know this stuff and we're technical about this stuff. But yet, I haven't really seen a lot of the methodology. I had to ask a question about where did the methodology come from. It wasn't presented in the slide. So I don't know enough about how you guys were directed to be able to say, yes, I'm good with that. I like what you've done and identifying all these barriers, but for us to have 18 slides and sign off and come back, and you guys come back in 3 weeks with a code audit, I can't get there in that amount of time. I'm sorry. That's just not enough information for me. For me, this packet should have included what your guys' scope going into it was. It should have included the housing needs analysis so that the rest of this, there's planning commissioners sitting at this table that haven't even seen the housing needs analysis. So I'm just not ready to be able to sign off in 3 weeks on this code. And I know that going forward, there's a lot more into it, but I've seen enough process in the city to know that once something gets in and gets written down, it's on a track. And that track can be veered a little bit, but it's moving really quick. And the side rails aren't enough for me right now. So.
Comments? You guys want to? Commissioner Breiler?
I did have that thought earlier that I had not seen that report and was assuming it was prior to my being seated on the commission. So if I could receive a copy of that report. I'm not going to read it all like John, but I will scan through it. And
Can I just follow up real quick?
Yeah,
So
thank
the housing needs analysis is 100 pages. It's an attachment to the comprehensive plan.
Okay.
So would you prefer a link or
is great.
a link to it? It is on the website, and we can point you to all of that.
And I think while you're at it, there was a reference to a handbook of
Missing Middle Handbook
Middle.
is also online. Yeah. Okay.
whatever
Sure.
you think that's.
Yeah, you don't need to, I don't want it, I don't want it in a printed format. It's helpful to have a clue of where to go for it.
Yeah. If I could respond to some of your comments too, John. We want to know what we can do to better move through the steps of this project. As you know, we're kind of bound by the scope of the grant and the timing that we have available to complete the work that the consultants are doing, but that doesn't limit us in terms of what we can do for outreach, what we can do to solicit comments from people who've been involved in housing tools, housing policy board, et cetera. Those are the kinds of folks that have knowledge that is very useful to this project, and we want to use you as an advisory committee to ask how we best get that input. And so we have a couple of thoughts, but we were hoping that's where we would go after the end of the presentation, and maybe we'll let you finish and then have that discussion of kind of how can we get where we need to be.
Okay.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay.
With that, why don't we let you finish?
Sure. It's a good discussion. So I just have a couple of kind of summary findings to walk through, getting, I think, to your question about kind of cross-cutting, what are some of the major issues. So first on the ADU requirements, like I mentioned, to come back to this. So the 3 standards that we've identified that we think are the most significant barriers to ADUs. The first is the owner occupancy requirement. I think there's been some discussion at this at prior work sessions about ADUs, but I think the challenge there is that it could discourage longer-term investment because there's a requirement to have a deed restriction, which if the property owner moves, then they might have to sell that property, can't rent it out. So it just kind of limits their options, and that could be something that discourages that what is a pretty significant investment to build an ADU. Off-street parking requirements can be difficult to meet. And this is basically because a lot of lots where single-family homes are on weren't designed to have 2 parking spaces. Some of them were, but not all of them were. And so just finding a way to accommodate 2 off-street parking spaces, so one for the primary dwelling and one for the ADU, can be a challenge. Put together a little diagram on this slide to try to illustrate that. So this is an actual lot in Eugene, and so there's plenty of room. This meets the minimum lot size standards, plenty of room for an ADU in the backyard. The driveway there would be required for the primary dwelling, and so really the only place to put another parking space would be actually in the front yard there with another curb cut. Not the best looking or appealing way to accommodate the parking is one challenge. And another thing is, in this situation, another curb cut would be required, which actually does remove some of the on-street parking there. So it's not really a lot of net additional parking that's created. So that just gets to some of the trade-offs and challenges with trying to accommodate more parking when you're doing an ADU on a site that just wasn't designed to accommodate multiple parking spaces. And then the minimum lot area standards, which were mentioned earlier, citywide, the requirement is 6,100 square feet. There was some previous analysis as part of the housing tools and strategies work that estimated that 15% of the lots citywide are smaller than that. So it's just a lot of lots that just wouldn't be eligible to be able to build an ADU. And then specifically in the university area neighborhoods, there's a higher standard for ADUs, and 50% of lots in that area would be not eligible. So just, again, restricting the citywide development potential for this type. Some discussion of the R1 zone, and so I think that was a kind of overall finding we wanted to identify. So some of the particular challenges in the R1 zone that are applied to multiple of the missing middle housing types. The maximum density of 14 units per acre is a barrier to several of them. Minimum lot area, which is related to density, but kind of separate. Minimum lot width, other lot dimension requirements could be barriers, particularly for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. Maximum lot coverage is a barrier for some of the other housing types, more on the range of the small lot detached, row houses, sometimes for a duplex and triplex. I think important to illustrate that the maximum lot coverage is a little bit easier to design around for some housing types. You can make the building a little bit taller and a little bit smaller and still meet it. But compared to minimum lot area, which you can't really design around the minimum lot area. The lots are already platted a lot of times, and that's the size they are, and it's hard to find a lot that meets the size requirements often. And so it's kind of a different nature of the barrier. Is it something that you can design around, or is it something that is a lot already platted and decided, and in order to get a larger lot, you have to acquire 2 lots and assemble them together, or so it's just kind of a different type of barrier. In the university area, there's a prohibition on duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and row houses. So this is a special limitation for that area, and just wanted to highlight that as something that just restricts the development potential citywide for those housing types. Wanted to come back to, because density was an issue that came up multiple times. So one of the challenges, I think, with density is that it's used as a way to address visual compatibility between different housing types. And it's a pretty good measure most of the time, but sometimes on the lower levels of density, it can be quite not related necessarily to the compatibility of different housing types. So this, I thought, was just a good example of that. There's a duplex next to a single-family house. The duplex is twice the density at 17 units per acre. Then the house is 8 units per acre. But in terms of the size of the building and the size of the building related to the size of the lot, they're almost mere reflection of each other. The only difference is that the duplex is divided into that floor area is divided into 2 units, so 2 small units versus 1 larger unit. So I think this just starts to speak to there are ways to control the bulk and size of buildings that might be more precise than density, and there might be other ways to do that. So, off-street parking was another. It's a commonly found as a barrier. I'd say there is some good news that we found in reviewing this is that the city has a standard of 1 space per unit that applies to most of these types, and that's usually not a barrier for most missing middle housing types. In fact, for a new development, often one parking space is provided because it makes it more marketable for the property. So when you get to 1.5 or 2 spaces per unit, that can start to be a barrier because that's sometimes hard to accommodate on a smaller site. But 1 space per unit is not necessarily. There is a trade-off with on lots that are more space constrained, requiring parking could actually result in a less attractive development than if you didn't require parking, because the parking can't be provided in the back or to the side, has to be provided in front. Sometimes it would look better if there was no parking at all. So that's just a trade-off to highlight, not necessarily a barrier. Internal conversions, so if a house was converted to a duplex or a triplex rather than being built new, that's kind of a different circumstance, and similar to the ADU, can be more difficult to meet parking requirements in that situation because the original lot really wasn't designed to have 2 parking spaces or 2 or more. And the city prohibits tandem parking from meet parking requirements, so 2 cars back to back in a driveway can't be counted as 2 spaces, it'd just be 1 space. And so that would be one potential option for meeting parking requirements for a situation like an internal conversion or a smaller lot where it's hard to meet that requirement. So the multiple family standards, these standards apply to a few of the housing types, so triplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartments, so anything with 3 or more units on 1 lot. And so we took a look at those. A few things to highlight here. There's a maximum setback requirement, so within the first within 20 feet of the front lot line, 40% of the lot, it's either 40 or 60% of the lot, the building must occupy that, be within that 20 feet. And that makes sense from kind of creating a more attractive streetscape, the building a little bit closer, and don't put parking in front of the building. But for some of these smaller housing types, it doesn't quite fit, and it also doesn't fit with necessarily kind of fitting into a single family character. But specifically like for something like a courtyard apartment, that can be a challenge. If you think about it, it's a U-shaped building, and they have the short sides of the building facing the street, which is intended kind of to replicate the feelings, the massing of a single family home. You have the short side of the building facing rather than a long wall along the street. But might not meet that standard to have 40% of the building within 20 feet. So it's an example of, I think, a standard that was designed for a different type of building than these. The minimum open space requirements could be challenges for a duplex, or a triplex or a fourplex on a smaller lot. Again, these are designed for larger apartment buildings that usually have more space to work with to accommodate that, and might be 3 or 4 stories tall rather than a kind of a smaller triplex or fourplex. There's an entrance requirement that requires that all ground floor units face the street. And so this is a particular barrier for a courtyard apartment, or for, it could be for a triplex or fourplex where the units are on the side or in the rear even. And so, for a courtyard apartment, though, the concept really is for the units to face an interior courtyard and not face the street. And so they need to seek an adjustment to that standard. Could be a barrier. There was some mention of some of the alternative tracks to have some of these projects approved. So we took a look at those. The two to highlight are the cluster subdivision and the plan unit development process. So the cluster subdivision has a minimum of 6 units that are required in that. And the prototypes we looked at were a cottage cluster with only 4 units, so that wouldn't be eligible for that. It's a pretty small project, but it might be a project that could be built on a lot of small lots or standard size lots. So it wouldn't be eligible for this process, so probably wouldn't be able to be built outside of this process. The cluster subdivision standards also, they allow for adjustments in lot dimensions, so the lot width and depth and area, but they don't allow for adjustments in the maximum density. And so you can have smaller lots, but you still need a significant amount of space and probably a lot of open space in order to meet the maximum density, if that makes sense. So some of the cottage cluster, one of the cottage cluster prototypes, the 4 unit, was 12 units per acre. In the R1 zone, the maximum was 14 units per acre, so that would meet that. But the larger one, that was 8 units, was 16 units per acre, so it wouldn't meet the maximum density. So kind of cluster subdivision provides some adjustment for minimum lot dimensions, but having some density bonus or density exemption or something like that for those types of projects would help to open up the opportunity for those. The PUD standards, we took a look at those. The minimum open space requirements are fairly significant and would be difficult to meet for some of those smaller cottage clusters that don't have a lot of open space, have some open space, but not a lot. There's also a minimum 30-foot landscape buffer that would that would require a pretty large site if you have 30 feet on every side and rear property line setback. So that's a potential barrier. And then, like was mentioned before, a PUD requires a Type 3 review, which a few reasons why that can kind of be a barrier. One is that just there's a little more uncertainty with the process. You talked about the susceptibility to appeal, but also just not being quite sure on whether or not the project will be approved in its current form or what conditions will be required for it to be approved. So that can be just discouraging for developers. The extra cost that's incurred just to prepare the PUD application, because there's a lot of submittal requirements for it. And then the complexity of the process might just discourage smaller developers that would rather not deal with kind of all the steps that are involved in it. So that can be a barrier as well. So I think that's all we have.
All right, I've got Commissioner Randall in the queue.
Okay, thank you. And I have several things here, so if it starts getting too long, I might ask for a second round. First, when you did your very preliminary findings page, you kind of skipped over number 3, but I think it's good to get back to that, where you say that density standards are key barriers for most housing types, yet density is an imprecise measure of compatibility. And I would agree with that. And I know I've brought up some of the density questions earlier, but yet I think, from my perspective, I think if we placed, not that we should throw density requirements out, but that if we placed more weight on mass, scale, and bulk over actual, like, density and dwelling units and all of those things, it gets back to that picture of the duplex next to the single-family house that you have right there. You know, I wouldn't mind living next door to either of those, frankly. And so I think that's maybe a good thing for us to consider as we move forward, how we shape, how we look at things as far as mass, scale, and bulk, rather maybe, and putting less weight on the actual dwelling units per acre.
Yeah, I would just add too, is that this duplex at 17 units per acre could be very incompatible with this single family, because it also could be very large, but I don't know what standards we're subject to, but that just illustrates that you know, buildings can look very different and still be the same density.
Yeah, and I go back to what's allowable even in our current R1, which is 35 feet high, 50% lot coverage. And so even though, you know, you might have a single-family house that is, you know, single-story, smaller footprint and those sorts of things, you could build a single-family residence that is quite large from a mass scale and bulk standpoint, regardless. I mean, if, you know, my neighbor's house is a lot taller than mine. Mine's 1 story. And so you get that variety. And so there's still some things in the code that are still allowed that I think, you know, we've got to be careful that just because I've chosen to build or have a 1,000 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath house on a pretty good sized lot, and my neighbor wants to build a, you know, 2-story house like that, I don't think I should be the one that says, well, you can't do that just because I've chosen to do a small house. So I think those are things that we've got to balance and be careful about. I'm glad to see the tandem parking thing in there too. I think that's a good thing to consider. And then let's just go down the list here, and maybe I'll just do it all at once. And then when you get down to the multifamily standards, I agree completely on the setback for 40 to 60% of the lot frontage and the entrance orientation. As we've done different projects, and I think especially as we do infill projects, maybe not so much on the larger lots that are, you know, multiple family to start with, but when you're doing a lot of these infill lots, and we've done some, and we almost always have had to do an adjustment review for those 2 items. And so if you're always seeing adjustment reviews, in fact, that might be something good to check if you haven't already. If that's what you're seeing the adjustment reviews for, maybe there's something wrong with the code. Because I think those are 2 that are big barriers, especially when you do infill housing. And then last comment on cluster subdivisions and PUD standards, I think those are a barrier primarily just because of the cost. And I know you're not always necessarily looking at the economics on this, but they're very costly, very involved process. As I'm not preaching to the choir, but so anything that we can do with the code that would eliminate the need to do those sorts of things would be good. I made it through.
Okay, I'm going to put myself in the queue, and then I'll go let Commissioner Borowski make a comment. I have a question. It's mostly about, you know, we've had the fair housing training here at Planning Commission, and one of the things that I came to understand, and maybe I'm incorrect, was that, you know, it was considered discriminatory for a neighborhood to only allow certain types of housing. You know, like I'm reading here, the university area has a prohibition on duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and row houses. Obviously, I know that's the way our code is written, but I'm wondering if you guys are looking at applying that filter at all, as far as like what is considered discriminatory based on the Federal Fair Housing Act? So that's my question.
It's a good question, a very tricky one. I don't think it's probably better questions for land use lawyers than for land use planners. Yeah, we would have to rely on case law precedents to be able to say whether this would be a fair housing issue or not. So it wasn't really within our scope to try to make that type of determination, yeah.
Can I add a comment on that?
Yeah, you can.
So our code, as it stands, is adopted and survived acknowledgement by DLCD. That being said, we are about to launch an update to our fair housing plan through the Community Development Division. And so that looks for things that could be vulnerable to a challenge from Fair Housing Council of Oregon or anybody else. So because there hasn't been a challenge of a standard doesn't mean that it couldn't be challenged in the future. So we will be doing that policy level work in the next couple of years as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Borowski.
Great. So, I'm really excited about a lot of these things that are coming forward. I mean, I think that especially like the cottage clusters and those types of things that have to go through a pretty rigorous standards. They have to do either multifamily standards or they have to get a PUD and stuff like that. I'm really excited about being able to carve out some sort of code that will allow those. And making them specific, so yeah, you can have a 1,700 square foot lot in a cottage cluster, but that may allow that little house to be sold off. Whereas if you do it the way it is now, you may not be able to do individual home ownership because of those types of things. So I'm very encouraged about that. When you were looking at barriers and you brought up some of the ones in the university neighborhood, those were put into place in 2014 for some specific reasons. And one of them was the impacts that we were seeing on infill in the university neighborhoods. We were seeing houses getting torn down and 5, 6, 7 bedroom houses putting in there and being rented to students, basically making small dormitories. So those were the interim measures. Those were supposed to be addressed through a neighborhood plan. They were, when they were put in 2014, everybody expected that by 2018 there would be some sort of an area plan that would help address those. But so I guess the question I have is, different parts of the city have different needs and different challenges. University neighborhood has obviously, needs that the student population draws. The Whitaker neighborhood has concerns about gentrification and the fact that the little cottage bungalows are going to get torn down and a fourplex is going to be put on that same lot, and the intensity is there. So, just to say that we want to be able to, there are barriers to these things. Some neighborhoods want some barriers, and so just to say that there are barriers, to me, doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. And I think it's something that's needed in certain areas. So weighing that back and forth between the balances of how to fit these types of properties in where we want them to go or where they're appropriate to go is one of the tough things. And getting to what Terry said as far as what are you looking for from us, what more do you need? I mean, we're all seeing the emails that are coming in, and we're getting emails from the neighborhood associations, we're getting the emails from the NLC saying we want to be a part of this to an extent that they can, and I, as a commissioner, want to listen to that because I'm making decisions that is going to be affecting their neighborhood. And if we move forward and don't conscientiously listen to what the people who are on the ground and living in these neighborhoods have, it's going to lead to a tough fight at city council. And I don't like seeing the fights at the city council. I like to see it have something move forward that everybody can live with. and realize, okay, well, we're all doing a part in moving this conversation forward, and not feeling like there's people that are being left out of that conversation to help move it forward. So that's what I'm hoping we can get from in the public, outreach that we're doing.
I'd like to just make a follow-up comment to that, because I think understanding the need, and I agree with Commissioner Borofsky on certain points, but I think that understanding the need that we are severely deficient in our housing units across the spectrum, and then the challenge of deciding, well, which neighborhoods get to decide where they need, who gets to make room. And I think that's kind of what I'm seeing in the conflict within the communities, is that you have neighborhoods that are saying, we don't want more density, we don't want more people in our neighborhoods, but we all know that as a community, we've got to make a lot more room for people between now and, the next time we might be looking at a UGB expansion. And so I think that it continues to be a challenge, and I just it's a personal observation, because I get those emails as well, and I think if every neighborhood felt the same way, we would not build anything. And so I think that everybody, I would implore the community to try and think about, where you're going to put your share of, the housing that we need. So did you have something else?
Yeah, I
Commissioner
feel like
Fragala?
we're getting into the more philosophical, area of these conversations. And I think, first of all, I'd like to say, I appreciate the focus on the middle housing piece, because when we talk about all of the different variables that we need to balance, the impacts on community livability and, how people feel about their neighborhoods, you look at that slide, a lot of these prototypes could fit into an R1 neighborhood, and I believe could fit into an R1 neighborhood and not impact the way that neighborhood views itself. I mean, I go back to the density issue that, that Commissioner, I know your first name, but I'm always like, we call each other by our last names. Randall brought up, in the neighborhood that I live in, these monstrous houses are getting built that I don't feel like reflect the community flavor or value, but they're a single family home, so they get to be built there, right? And so I appreciate the focus on these types of housing, because I think it balances that concern that you're bringing up. But I also agree that we need to look at, what else are we balancing in this density issue? Because, we're looking at our climate change plan, right? We want our communities to be compact, and so that we don't have to, people don't have to be driving really long distances. Like, what does it look like if we have to expand our UGB, right? I mean, we want to go dense. I think there's a lot of feedback that we've heard in the community that dense is a priority value for the community. And so I think there are a lot of pieces we need to balance, and I think some of these things can balance those pieces, so I appreciate the focus. And then if we want to talk about who we need to hear from, I know we might be being asked by the NLC and to be at the table, but I'm on the board of a neighborhood association, right? And we actually represent a very small perspective of the neighbors in our community. And so if we're going to do a broader outreach, we need to make sure that it's a broad outreach, not just the NLC, not just the neighborhood associations. I mean, you look at the process that's happened in River Road in Santa Clara, that has been a broad outreach. There's been significant community involvement in there. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. It costs money. But I think it could be worthwhile. So some of my philosophical leanings.
Right. Commissioner Ramey.
So just quickly to pile on the philosophy musings here. We had two good examples that it's not necessarily the way a project looks. And one was Lisa's example of large houses, which are still single-family houses, but they're very large. They don't look like the house next door, which is very small. And then the example we saw on the slide of a duplex and a single-family house next to each other, they look the same. I think what we want to be careful about and why we have density to begin with is all the activities that come with that. When you double up the family in the house, you double up the garbage collection, the parking, all that activity that happens on the street. And that's why, another reason we use density, it's not just about the shape and the size of the building, it's about the activity that comes with it. So we just need to be careful that when we start talking about density, we don't forget those kinds of issues. And there are ways to mitigate those, certainly. I think corner lots, other techniques over the years that have been used. But we just need to be careful that it's not just a look of the structure, it's the activity that's following that structure.
And that kind of goes to what we were worried about in the university neighborhood. So university neighborhood is R1, and they started building big R1s, 5, 6 bedroom R1s, and renting them all out. And the concern that we would have in that neighborhood, I think that I've heard from my neighbors is you're going to take a 5,000 square foot lot and put a fourplex on there. Well, you think, okay, well, that's 4 car, 4 parking spots.
Right.
But in that neighborhood, that's going to be a 4, 2 or 3 bedroom per thing. So now instead of having 3 bedrooms in a small bungalow, you've got 12 bedrooms, and each one of those is a student, and each one of those students has a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and now you've got 24 people living on a lot that used to have 3 people living on it, and the impacts to the neighborhood.
If I could loop back to your initial comment, just to follow up, and it's a really good one about public involvement and engaging, and maybe some of those barriers are good. And I think, again, this is meant to identify what they might possibly be. It is a policy conversation to decide how to solve them and where you want to solve them and where they are important and part of, creating the character that you want and the city that you want. So we recognize that, of course. That I think what we were looking for, a head nod on the methodology was only really to share with you how the prototypes work and to the kinds of barriers that we were looking at and to bring you up to speed with that so that when we did introduce the draft report to you and you had a chance to read it, you wouldn't be looking at this going, oh, what on earth would they do and what does this all mean? And so really not asking you to say, yes, we absolutely support these outcomes or any of that. We realize that all of that will have to follow this project. Our timeline is so short that we're hoping to give you useful information, an outsider's perspective, right? That says, we came in, we applied these tests to this code, here's some information. That then becomes it's a tool in your toolbox to help you potentially go forward with your conversations about your housing, the comp plan, housing element, and so forth. And this is meant to be kind of helpful information towards that, not expecting the Planning Commission with so little opportunity for public input to say, yes, we absolutely validate this, but only to bring you up to speed with where we're going, if that sounds reasonable. So.
I think it's something we could try to do in the report as well as for those, like the university area, like you mentioned, would be to note in there where, so there are prohibitions on these types that came out of this 2014 decision, to link it to this was a policy decision at one point. We want to make sure it's clear that the barriers aren't necessarily all inadvertent. Sometimes they might be, oh, we didn't mean to do that by writing the code that way. Sometimes we wrote the code that way because it was a policy for the neighborhood. And so we would acknowledge that, I think, in the report as well. So
I think it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think that it's more complicated to, have a scope of work where you're identifying barriers and potentially making recommendations on what it would look like to remove those. But then also, as we've been seeing with the Housing Tools and Strategies process, it's it's easier to say, go ahead and identify those barriers and start working at removing them. And then there's a lot of details and the devil in the details where there's a reason that we have, protection for our water sources and things like that. So All right, does anybody else?
Just one.
Yeah, go
So
ahead,
there must
Commissioner
be
Ramey.
best practices that you discovered as you've done this for other communities. And that seems like an easy, low-hanging fruit, just to put that in the report. Here's 15 things somebody else did who was in the similar situation that you were in. So we don't have to make it all up from the start. We can look to see what other communities have done. If you've done that, I presume you're doing this in other communities. So can you share that work with us and we can use that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and we can, and will provide you in some context for these. And I think when you see the overall report, you're going to, and the source of the prototypes themselves actually reflect
Yeah, that would-
some of that best practices, obviously, because they are prototypes of things that have, in many cases, been built elsewhere. So,
Good.
yeah, but we'll try and provide some context.
All right.
We're mostly out of time. I just want to make one more comment. We'll follow up with what some of our ideas are to do outreach to the public. I mean, in short, it's our kind of familiar tools plus anything else we want to highlight. Bye, Patrick. So our Envision Eugene newsletter goes out at the end of the month. We're including an article on this project. We're creating a website for the project, and we talked internally about maybe attaching some survey questions to the newsletter and getting that out to anybody we think would be interested. So those are some minimal things we can do within our short timeline. But the funding for this code audit was broken into 3 buckets. You could use it to, or apply for funding for a housing needs analysis, which we already did, a code audit, or code amendments, if you had an audit or a housing needs assessment that identified certain needs. So we went into that middle bucket and hope that there will be additional funding to actually implement and run a full code amendment process, which you all know is very intensive and includes a lot of public involvement as we decide what we actually want to do. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you, that's
Sure.
important clarification.
Thank you so much for coming down, you guys. We have
Great,
a couple
yes.
more business items.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other items from staff, or?
Just can do a quick schedule, I guess not an update, just maybe an overview. You did get the most recent Planning Commission schedule. Your next meeting is not until April 16th, so you got a little spring break. And that will be on Clear and Objective. You'll have 3 meetings in April, the 16th, which is a Tuesday in the evening, Monday, the 22nd during the day, and then April 23rd, also in the evening. And then we will be looking to add a meeting or 2 in June. We had sent out a poll for that. I think it was last week. Thank you to all of you who've responded, looking to add an additional meeting for deliberations for the downtown riverfront. We should have something out to you by the end of the week for that. And then just a heads up, although we're not going to know this for a while, it's possible that in May or June we'll also have an appeal of a land use application. So we'll need a hearing and deliberations for that as well. And then in terms of council, well, actually, that would jump it. We'll talk about boards and commissions in just a minute, but there will be doing interviews on Monday, April 22nd and 24th for board and commission members or applicants. Thank you. And then there actually are a lot of PDD items coming up at council. The first planning one is actually May 8th, which would be River Road, Santa Clara neighborhood plan. Other big topic, May 15th will be the economic cartography. And then May 20th, we've got Clear and Objective, and it'll be the LUBA remand public hearing on ADUs will also be that evening. Yeah, so lots going on. Yeah.
So on the recruitment, I know there was the deadline passed last week, and I think it's 13 applicants. I didn't get the final number for Planning Commission. So right now, the council is being polled on who they want to interview for those dates in April. So that's where that sits.
Okay. Yeah, they tend to appoint those in June, so, yeah.
Oh, and Commissioner Randall will be having his last Planning Commission meeting in June. So we'll find an appropriate way to celebrate his years of service with the Planning Commission.
Yes.
We're working on that.
Right. Any items from commissioners? Commissioner?
Commissioner Ramey and I attended the Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee. So that process is in process. We went over the preliminary allocations, and there'll be a public hearing first part of next month, and then it'll move to council for adoption. That's up in the air. It was supposed to be in April, but I think it's going to get pushed to May in front of council. So that process is going forward, which is helping to increase our affordable housing stock and our human services delivery here in Eugene. There was $1 million or something that's going to be allocated this year to several different projects, but not enough.
Not enough.
It's never enough. All right, anybody else?
Maybe I'll mention another thing. Since we talked about River Road and Santa Clara neighborhood planning, it is going to council May 8th, but before that, in April, there will be the next round of community-wide forums, and those dates have been set for April 7th and 10th. And I believe they'll be covered in the upcoming newsletter as well, so you'll know a little bit more about that.
Okay.
Oh, and also the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee is ongoing and working. We have a meeting this week, Thursday. And so what our focus is on that right now is the urban reserves planning. So we're going through a bunch of the technical data on all the housing needs analysis and where and what lands are available and that type of stuff. So that's the first impetus of that committee. After that, getting to Commissioner Fragala's comments, after we figure out the urban reserves, which was mandated to be done within the first year, then we will move on to the monitoring part of that committee, which will actually start looking at the number of units built and permits and all that type of stuff to see if the numbers that we had projected are actually being built. And so that's the second phase of the ETAC group. So we're not getting into that yet because we're tasked with doing the urban reserves first. So
Urban reserves is also on the Planning Commission agenda in May, so you'll get an update on that. Yep.
All right, well, if there isn't anything else, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn our meeting of the Planning Commission.